One of the most revolutionary pieces of evidence in the story of human origins was never hidden in a cave, never locked in a museum vault, and never lost beneath a collapsed layer of stone. It was sitting in plain sight, printed in an old scientific paper, arranged neatly in a table, carrying a conclusion so uncomfortable that it almost feels unreal today. Long before the public was told that Europe belonged to Neanderthals until modern humans arrived late from elsewhere, one of the most famous names in human evolution helped publish a chart that placed several European fossils inside a broad Homo sapiens grade structure. Not as modern humans exactly, not as Neanderthals exactly, not as Homo erectus, but as ancient members of a human grade occupying a strange middle ground that the later textbook story had little room to explain. That is where the real mystery begins, because the chart does not merely mention Africa, or the Levant, or the familiar modern human fossils from School and Kafse. It places European fossils into the same grand human framework. It places Sacopastore, Ehringsdorf and Fontechevade in Homo sapiens grade 2. It places Petrolona, Mauer, Vertes Solos and Bildungsleben in the lowest level in Homo sapiens grade 1. At the top in Homo sapiens grade 3, it places not only Cro-Magnon and Meladec, but also La Ferracie, La Chapelle, Shanidar, Amud, Tabun, School and Kafse. In other words, the table does not describe a clean world where Neanderthals are one thing, modern humans are another thing, and Europe waits passively for a late invasion of true humans. It describes a graded human landscape, a fossil record in motion, and a Europe filled with forms that were difficult to push outside the human story. The most explosive part is the authorship. This was not written by an outsider. It was not written by a fringe theorist trying to overturn the field from the margins. It was written by three legends of the field, Chris Stringer, Clark Howell and John Melentis, in a study on the fossil hominid skull from Petrolona, Greece. That matters, because Stringer became one of the best-known defenders of the recent African origin model. And yet here, in this earlier framework, the fossil evidence was being organized in a way that looks very different from the simplified version of human evolution that later reached the public. Petrolona was not being dismissed as irrelevant. Ehringsdorf was not being waved away as an evolutionary dead end. Sacopastore was not treated as a meaningless oddity. These fossils were part of a wider argument about human grades, human variation, and the evolutionary transition from more archaic forms toward later humans. The chart is powerful because it does something modern storytelling often avoids. It admits complexity. It does not force every fossil into a rigid box. It does not pretend that one skull has to be either fully modern or fully non-human. It recognizes that the middle Pleistocene and later Pleistocene human record is full of intermediate forms, regional mosaics, and anatomical combinations that do not obey a neat migration cartoon. Ehringsdorf and Sacopastore are especially important for that reason, because they are European, they are ancient, and they sit in a grade that is more advanced than the deepest archaic category, but not folded neatly into the final modern human package. They occupy the dangerous middle of the story, the place where the old out-of-Africa narrative begins to crack. Sacopastore, from Italy, is one of those fossils that should be far more famous than it is. It has often been discussed in relation to Neanderthals, but its position in this old grade structure shows that the problem was never simple. The skull does not merely represent a brute ancestor waiting to be replaced. It belongs to a European human form that carried a mix of traits, some archaic, some more derived, some difficult to classify without admitting that Europe itself had a deep and complicated human history. Ehringsdorf, from Germany, creates the same problem from another angle. It represents ancient European humanity not as a side note, but as part of a sequence. These fossils do not sit comfortably inside the later story in which real Homo sapiens appear late, arrive suddenly, and overwrite a continent of unrelated Neanderthals. They belong to a more tangled world. And that is why this chart matters. It shows that the scientific discussion was not always as simple as the out-of-Africa version became. There was a time when serious researchers could look at Petrolona, Mauer, Sacopastore, Ehringsdorf, La Ferracie, Kafse, School, Cro-Magnon and Meladec, and organize them across a broad Homo sapiens grade structure. That does not mean every specimen was modern. It does not mean every ancient European skull was identical to us. It means the boundary was not clean. It means the human story was being understood as a spectrum of related forms, not a fairy tale of one pure population appearing fully formed and replacing everything else. The same chart also creates a second problem from the opposite direction. Broken Hill, better known as Kabwe, and Bodo were not placed high in the structure. They were placed in Homo sapiens grade 1, the lowest and most archaic part of the sequence, below Sacopastore and Ehringsdorf, and far below the later grade that included Kafse, Schkuhl, Cro-Magnon, Maladek, and the classic Neanderthals. That matters because it cuts against a modern habit of forcing every important African skull into an automatic pre-sapiens role, as if geography itself can do the anatomical work. Kabwe and Bodo are enormously important fossils, but in this framework they were not the most sapiens-like specimens. They were the rougher end of the grade, the heavy-browed, thick-boned, archaic base of the structure, and that basic point has not disappeared. Later work associated with Stringer continued to treat Kabwe, Bodo, Petrolona, and similar Middle Pleistocene fossils as part of a more archaic Homo heidelbergensis or Homo rhodesiensis problem, not as clean early modern humans. In other words, the same evidence that gives Europe an overlooked Homo sapiens grade 2 problem also warns against pretending that every African fossil of the same general age automatically belongs near the direct doorway to modern humanity. Now consider the consequence. If Sacopastore and Ehringsdorf were placed in Homo sapiens grade 2, then ancient Europe was not simply the land of non-human Neanderthals. It contained human forms that earlier researchers recognized as part of a larger sapiens grade transition. That is not a small detail. That changes the emotional center of the story. It means Europe was not merely a dead end. It was one of the theaters where human anatomy was being tested, reshaped, and recombined. It means the fossils of Europe were not just obstacles to modern human origins. They were evidence for a much more complicated human emergence. This is where the phrase, "should not exist," becomes useful. These fossils exist physically, of course. Their bones are real. Their measurements are real. Their place in the literature is real. What should not exist is their role inside the simplified story. A Homo sapiens grade 2. Europe should not exist if the out-of-Africa version is taken too literally. A chart placing Sacopastore and Ehringsdorf inside that grade should not exist if Europe was only a Neanderthal holding pen until late modern humans arrived. A Petrolona paper by Christopher Stringer that treats these fossils inside a broad Homo sapiens grade system should not exist if the field had always spoken with one voice about a clean separation between archaic Europeans and true humans. But it does exist, and that is the evidence payoff. The deeper you look, the more the chart starts to look less like an outdated curiosity and more like a window into a road not taken. Later, terminology changed. Fossils were reassigned, new dating methods appeared, ancient DNA transformed the field, but none of that erases the central problem. The fossils did not become simpler. If anything, the evidence became harder to force into clean boxes. DNA proved that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. Fossils such as Epidimer forced researchers to confront early sapiens-like anatomy in Greece. The Levant became a place of long contact and overlap rather than a failed migration footnote. Denisovans appeared from almost nothing and changed the map of Asia. Every resolution made the old neat story harder to defend in its simplest form. That is why Ehringsdorf and Sacopastore matter. They are not just names in an old table. They are reminders that Europe's fossil record has always contained forms that resist easy classification. They sit between categories. They complicate the boundary between Neanderthal and modern human. They suggest that ancient Europe contained more than one kind of human anatomy, more than one evolutionary experiment, and perhaps more continuity than the replacement story wanted to admit. The final twist is that this does not require throwing away science. It requires taking the older science seriously, especially when it was written by the same figures who later shaped the modern debate. The point is not that one table solves human evolution. The point is that one table reveals how much complexity was already visible. Before the public was taught a simplified story, specialists were already wrestling with a fossil record that looked graded, regional, and deeply entangled. Petrolona was part of that argument. Bodo and Broken Hill were part of that argument. Sacopastore and Ehringsdorf were part of that argument. And Europe, far from being an empty stage waiting for late modern humans, was already filled with ancient human forms that refused to disappear from the family tree. So the real question is not whether these fossils exist. The real question is why their implications became so quiet. Why did the textbooks remember the clean replacement story but forget the grade structure? Why did Apidima become shocking when an older chart had already placed Petrolona, Sacopastore, and Ehringsdorf inside a broader human framework? Why were ancient European Homo sapiens grade fossils allowed to fade into specialist literature while the public was handed a much simpler map? The answer is not that the chart was wrong because it was old. Old evidence is not automatically dead evidence. In human evolution, old evidence often becomes more important when new discoveries force the field to circle back. And in this case, the chart looks less like a relic and more like a warning. It warned that the human family tree was never a clean ladder. It warned that Europe was never a simple Neanderthal cage. It warned that the boundary between ancient humans and modern humans was always contested, always blurred, and always more complicated than the story most people were told. And this is the deeper point. Human evolution is not settled. It has never been settled. It has only been simplified for public consumption, compressed into maps, arrows, and classroom diagrams that make the story look cleaner than the evidence itself. The fossils do not speak in straight lines. The skulls do not arrange themselves politely into one continent, one origin, one migration, one replacement, and one victorious population. They scatter across Africa, Europe, the Levant and Asia in patterns that are messy, overlapping and deeply uncomfortable for any theory that tries to make one region carry the entire burden of becoming human. We do not truly know where Homo sapiens began. We know where some of the most important fossils have been found. We know that Africa preserves extraordinary early material, from Jebel Irhoud to Omo to Herto. We know that the Levant preserves early humans with unmistakable significance at School and Kafse. We know that Greece now forces itself into the discussion through Apidima. We know that Europe contains older fossils that earlier researchers were willing to place inside a broad Homo sapiens grade structure. We know that Asia has produced skulls and jaws that grow stranger with every new comparison. But knowing where evidence has survived is not the same as knowing where the process began. The fossil record is not a complete archive. It is a damaged, uneven, accidental survival of bones, caves, river gravels, quarry walls and museum drawers. That is why the old certainty is starting to look fragile. The story was never simply that one small population became fully human in one place and then replaced a planet of failures. The evidence points to something more complicated, something more networked, something closer to a vast human metapopulation spread across connected regions, sometimes isolated, sometimes reunited, sometimes exchanging genes, tools, behaviors, and anatomy across enormous spans of time. In that kind of world, human origins do not look like a single birth certificate. They look like a long, uneven convergence, with different regions contributing different pieces of the final human form. This does not mean that every version of multi-regional theory was correct. It means the replacement story was too simple. It means that the sharp boundary between modern human and archaic human has broken down again and again. Neanderthals were not evolutionary strangers. Denisovans were not irrelevant ghosts. African Middle Pleistocene fossils were not all marching neatly toward us in a single line. European fossils were not all dead ends. The Levant was not merely a failed corridor. The deeper record shows contact, structure, mixture, survival, and regional persistence. So when we look back at a chart like this, the lesson is not nostalgia. The lesson is warning. The old fossils were already telling us that the human story was graded, tangled, and unfinished. The new evidence has not made that problem disappear. It has made it harder to ignore. Homo sapiens did not emerge from a cartoon arrow. We came from a world of connected ancient humans, and the true birthplace of our species is still an open question. It could be Africa. It could be a broader Afro-Eurasian network. It could be far more multi-regional than the public was ever told. And if the fossils of Petrolona, Sacopastore, Ehringsdorf, Bodo, Kabwe, Skull, Kafse and Apidema teach us anything, it is this. The human origin story is not finished. It is only beginning to become honest. Thank you for watching. And the next time someone says that ancient Homo sapiens in Europe begins and ends with one shocking skull from Greece, remember Ehringsdorf. Remember Sacopastore. Remember Petrolona. Remember the chart that placed them inside the human grade structure, and remember who helped write it. Because sometimes the most revolutionary evidence is not discovered yesterday. Sometimes it has been sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting for people to notice what it really said.